Good morning. I'd first like to thank the Emirates Center for Strategic Studies and Research for inviting me, allowing me to come here and speak with you and share my thoughts. And I will put out the disclaimer as a U.S. military person. This presentation reflects my thoughts alone and doesn't represent those specific to the United States Navy or the Department of Defense or the U.S. government, but just of my own. I'll be talking about maritime security in the Gulf today. Just to give you a snapshot of what I intend to discuss, I'll put it in the context of oil as a major export in the region. I'll focus a lot of my talk on the threats that Iran possesses, specifically their naval capabilities. And then I'll talk about some of the ways the U.S. and various other maritime partnerships in the region are providing maritime security. And then finally, I'll offer a proposal of a study moving forward and how we can better conduct maritime security together in the future. So for context, from 2016 to 2018, approximately 20 million barrels of oil per day passed through the Strait of Hormuz, which, as previously mentioned, represents approximately 20% of global oil production. And to put it in context for some of the GCC countries specifically, oil makes up approximately 50% of GDP for both Kuwait and Qatar, and it is a major component for the other 4 countries. So what does this mean? It means the safeguarding of the flows of oil and other commerce, both in and out of the Strait and through the Gulf, will remain a priority for the Gulf countries. And comparing the Strait of Hormuz to some of the other maritime choke points globally, you can see here that the Strait of Hormuz has the highest in the world. With the context of maritime security and Iran, I'd like to point out a couple things. First, obviously the proximity of Iran to the Gulf, its entire eastern shore, allows Iran to quickly project forces or power, both naval forces or air power, and that's an advantage for them. And secondly, and maybe more indirectly, but maybe more important, Iran's aspirations to become a regional hegemon, specifically in their use of non-state proxies, for example, the Houthis in Yemen, Hezbollah in Lebanon. All of this, their malign actions of those actors and the malign actions of Iran in general throughout the region have more or less pressurized the entire Gulf region and has brought pressure to the maritime realm, the Gulf itself. Moving forward to military capabilities of Iran, they have just over 600,000 active duty members of their military, of which approximately 38,000 belong to their naval forces. And that's comprised of both the IRIN, which primarily operate outside of the Gulf, and the IRGCN, which primarily operate within the Gulf. As far as their capabilities go, they have a wide array of both asymmetric and conventional military capabilities. I'll talk a little bit more about each of these, but traditional naval assets, ships, submarines, and aircraft, but they also have some asymmetric capabilities, specifically when you look at cyber capabilities and electronic warfare capabilities. Perhaps at the core of Iran's naval force and coastal defense is their fleet of small boats. Fast attack craft and fast inshore attack craft possess various weapons and patrol throughout the Gulf region. And they're often seen harassing both military vessels and merchant vessels. Iran has a submarine fleet, notably comprised of 3 Kilo class Russian submarines, with additionally some smaller submarines. And of note, there are operating constraints within the Gulf, with the depth limitations. It is limiting in how they can utilize submarines, especially their larger ones within the Gulf itself. Iran has a vast inventory of naval mines and what we refer to as limpet mines or magnetically attached mines, similar to the ones we saw placed on the merchant vessels late last year. But to accompany their mines, they also have a wide array of vessels that can quickly employ them. And I would even go as fast as say that they could employ them without really anyone even noticing. Obviously, these mines would hinder maneuverability throughout the Gulf or can disrupt maritime traffic altogether, depending on how they're emplaced. Maybe one of the most emerging threats that Iran has used is the use of unmanned aerial vehicles or drones. Historically, they've used these primarily in a reconnaissance role, but recent events and attacks at Saudi Arabia oil facilities indicates that UAVs are being weaponized and will probably continue to be weaponized. Iran possesses a series of coastal defense cruise missiles with ranges that span the Gulf in its entirety, and also a series of ballistic missiles that span ranges across the entire region to include Eastern Africa and parts of Eastern Europe. So shifting away from the threats, I'd like to take a moment to talk about the U.S. Role in the region. The U.S., the United States, has been in a leading role to some degree to provide more or less a military counterbalance to Iran. The U.S. Navy's Fifth Fleet is headquartered in Bahrain, along with other key bases in and around the region. Specific to Fifth Fleet, the way that the U.S. task organizes its forces is through a series of task forces that are functionally assigned missions. So for instance, some do mine warfare, some do nothing but logistic support, and some do submarine and anti-submarine operations, just to name a few. Now, if you allow me just for a minute, if you were to take Fifth Fleet out of the equation, at least just for one slide, I think you'd find this pretty interesting. In general, if you look at the GCC naval forces in aggregate or in total, the GCC naval forces generally exceed Iran's, at least in quantity. And while Iran possesses more submarines, the GCC in total possesses significantly more blue water Navy capabilities. In fact, if you look at specifically their surface fleet or their ships, it's almost a 2-to-1 ratio over Iran in that regard. And to take it one more step further, just to highlight, in 2018, looking at defense spending, GCC almost spent 7 times more on defense than Iran did, 135 billion US dollars versus 20 billion US dollars for Iran. And I'll caveat, the spending alone doesn't necessarily translate to capability or effects, but at least gives a glimpse of the promise that the GCC naval power can bring when combined. I'd like to take a moment to talk about some of the ways that security cooperation is conducted today in the Gulf. First, the Combined Maritime Forces is a partnership of 33 nations, also headquartered in Bahrain. They've been in place since the early 2000s, but they're broken up into a few different task forces that look at maritime security within the Gulf, maritime security in the waters around the region, the Red Sea, the Gulf of Oman, and then they also have a counter-piracy mission as well. More recently, back in late last year, the U.S. led an initiative to stand up the International Maritime Security Construct, which was in the wake of the merchant vessels being attacked. And this was an initiative to help support providing maritime security in and out of the Strait of Hormuz. And finally, there's a initiative, a French-led initiative that is a European security initiative that has been in place really just since last month and includes 8 nations all from Western Europe. So with that in mind, in light of what Fifth Fleet is doing in the region, the existing maritime partnerships that are in the region operating, even unilateral operations, and in light of the evolving Iranian threat, I think we ought to be looking at this problem collectively, both the GCC and the US and other stakeholders, to counter what Iran is doing. And I'll pose a question: is the status quo of what we're doing, does it suffice? I think it's mutually beneficial to take a holistic look across the region to see if there's better ways to conduct maritime security. And in order to do that, I would argue that there is a general lack of understanding across the board, really, of the constraints and restraints that individual nations have when contributing to a maritime security mission. For example, having an understanding of training shortfalls for their naval forces, or capabilities or capability gaps that a naval force may have. Maybe there's spending constraints within their ministers of defense, or maybe there's legal objections or legal hurdles that have to be overcome. Or maybe there's bilateral or multilateral security cooperation or information sharing agreements that are in place that make it difficult to work together. I would argue that there's not a great understanding across the community as a whole to be able to overcome and work together more coherently. So what I'm offering is a study that the Atlantic Council, the organization I come from, is considering doing, and that's taking a holistic look across the region to look at some of these and not only identify them, but maybe even look at opportunities for GCC countries in general to take more of leadership roles. Not that the U.S. Would instantly leave, but the U.S. could maybe be more in a U.S. Leadership role to enable a GCC maritime security effort. So I think, in conclusion, it's in the interest of all GCC countries and the U.S. to have a stable Gulf and a free flow of commerce throughout the region. I would be interested in hearing your thoughts either in this forum or off to the side afterwards, and the promise that maybe a study like this can have. And with that, I thank you for your time.